on the bottom of page 92 tonight. So just to bring us into the text a little bit, we're going to start at the bottom. Jer Chung has a final question he's going to ask the Sixth Patriarch. But if we go back, there's been this exchange, a back and forth. Jer Chung has finally realized that cultivation's something that happens on one's own mind ground, on the nature, in one's own person, and it's not accomplished or realized outside or doesn't come from outside. And finally he's seen that his two obstacles that he had, one which was to attach to the physical manifestations of practice, even meditation states, was not ultimate and actually could be a distraction. And then even wanting to get anything, and this is the important part of his second realization, even the wanting to get anything at all is moving away from the essential meaning. This is the hardest one to get at. And the reason this is the case is because if you look at all the sutras in the text, they say this is the fundamental problem of the human condition, is the seeking, the grasping, the wanting. This nature, it says the nature, to be a living being is to be grasping, to wanting, and it's this Sanskrit graha, which means grab, to take hold of. From the moment we're born, and if you look closely at the text, even before the moment we're born, in the very act of coming into being, there is a grasping, there's an attaching, and this keeps everything going. And so the grasping and attaching impulse, or it almost becomes an habituation that's very hard to catch. Sometimes when you're doing meditation for long periods of time in a retreat, and you start to calm down your eyes and ears and nose and tongue in your body, and you sit quietly, you can feel the pulsing energy of this wanting, this longing, this yearning, this grasping energy. And you can actually kind of viscerally, palpably get at it. It's like this hum, this white noise below the surface of our consciousness. And it's this stream of habituation that just keeps us going and going and going. It's the essence of what samsara means, to go on. And that's why it said living beings grasping everywhere, cover over this wondrous. So here, this second part is, in one sense, he's given up so many things as a monk that normally people would grasp after: name and fame and benefit, a lot of material possessions, fine food, and so forth. He lives a very simple, almost dismantled life, in the sense that he's just living on what he needs and not on what he greeds for. So he's just taking things as they come. And there's a certain simplicity and liberation he gets, but underneath still that surface energy goes, and this is where the Buddha's really goes deep in what he calls the nature of suffering, or dukkha, is until that is quieted, until that, I wouldn't call it a voice, it's not even that distinct, until that impulse, that almost unconscious longing is finally put to rest. When the flames of that cease, that very ceasing is awakening. That's what Bodhi is called. And so Bodhi is not something that you get after this happens, but in the very stopping or letting go of that, which is very interesting because some people say it's stopping, but actually what he's proposing here is you let go of it. You don't stop it, you let go of it, and you really, when you let go of it, it's because essentially there's nothing there to begin with. So it's a spook. I use the word spook. Growing up on a farm, this is something that the animals, the horses and the cows, will get spooked. And they get spooked because they think they see something or hear something that's really not there, and then they start to rush around, being chased or moved by shadows. This isn't exactly what the Buddha says. He doesn't use this language. He uses avidya, which is confused, misperception, but it means the same thing. We become spooked, and therefore in spook we start to move and seek and grasp. And the further we go in this process, the further away from our essential nature we go. So while we can talk about this, it is a deep, it's powerful, it's called the root of everything else. And part of the goal of your cultivation is to circle closer and closer to that root until you finally get it. And you, as Hanshan says, it goes deep and you have to pull it out. It's like a weed. I'm doing my weeding now. And I've learned that by going and quickly pulling it, I got my weeding done. I just pulled the weeds off, but I only got the surface. And I learned this over the years. I pull that weed off and it's great. And then it comes back and it comes back. And it's because the root of the weed goes very, very deep. So I do this little gong fu thing. I get the weed and I go down and then I'm slowly feeling it. And it's best when the water, the land is really wet and moist. And then you can feel this back and forth. And if you go too fast, you break it off and the root's still there. And it's really, it's a kind of metaphor for how you go about getting at the root of this. But until that root is gone, even at this case where he's simplified his life down to seemingly seeking nothing, he's still seeking what he calls the truly so, Rushi, the Tathagata's awakened state. That's what his little verse above when he says the five skandhas he sees are empty, but even wanting the truly so is still the same mind but after a different object. And what the Sixth Patriarch is saying, it's good that you want the truly so to begin with, but now that you've gone to this stage, even wanting the truly so, you have to let go of. But he couldn't have said at the beginning, don't seek the truly so, because that would have stopped him from getting to where he got. So you can see how there's this gradual thing happening, but even though that's gradual, now he's going to what's called the direct. It's no longer gradual, it's no longer provisional. He's saying, wake up and realize that even wanting the truly so obstructs you. And so then he gives them these instructions. And then the important line that we read last week over again, only when you understand, this is the middle of page 92, this is the Sixth Patriarch talking to him, only when you understand there's nothing to attain can you set up all the myriad teachings. Now, this could seem like a nihilistic statement, there's nothing to attain, but what's meant by this is very important. It means actually the opposite. There's nothing to attain because you already have it. If you didn't have it, you'd have to seek and attain it, but because you already have it, there's nothing to attain. So it doesn't mean there's nothing. Again, I want to stress this. There's nothing to attain. So therefore, not grasping, not seeking, not wanting is in fact cultivation. Cultivation is not wanting to get or to do something to increase your meditation practice and so forth. It's actually stopping the mind that wants to get anything at all. And so all the techniques of meditation or whatever practice you take up is nothing more than get to the point of, the language that's sometimes used is attaining nothing to attain. In other words, getting to that point where everything's okay, no problem. And that means that pulsing thing has to stop. I don't know if you relate to this viscerally, but there's just this unquenchable thirst, and that's the other word the Buddha used for it, trishna. It's a thirst, and it's unquenchable, not because the water's bad, or it's unquenchable because it's unrealistic. It's an irrational thirst. It's a longing that can never be requited because its basis is essentially false. Its premise is false. And so this longing, it can be in our thoughts of just kind of wanting constant stimulation. Or it can be in the tongue, constantly wanting more flavors, different flavors, multitude of sensory experience. I was just reading something. It comes out in different ways how it manifests in the human. There was a study done by two people. One was Stanford, I believe. The other one was maybe at MIT. Did you all see that this week about the nature of what's called false news or fake news? It's a very interesting study. What they found essentially, if I can remember it right, even though the news is obviously this event or something is false, it actually attracts more attention than the true news. And it spreads faster across social media than the true does. And so they were just noticing this, and they said, therefore, this is a very difficult problem, because no matter how much truth you counter the false with, it's the false that spreads fastest and takes hold more readily. And in their analysis of why this is the case, they came up with this idea is because it's novel. It's novelty. It's something new and different. And it then strokes the urge to have something new and different, exciting. And the same psychological, deep psychological urge, which I'm saying is close to what the Buddha is talking about here, also drives the phenomena of addiction to social media. And, sitting there, they just watch people and it goes beep, and you go down and pick it up. It's a text message or it's a beep or notification. I've had somebody, one of my nieces, was saying, fix your computer. I said, well, there's nothing wrong with it. She says, yes, there is. There's a little thing that comes up on the right-hand corner from CNN or someplace that announces something. And I said, oh, you didn't notice? No, I didn't even notice. She says, I cannot not notice. And then I have to go click to it right away to find out what it was, and I can't finish what I'm doing. And I'm like, wow. So the setup is these things work, and they spread because the underlying impulse is an anxiety and a need to be distracted and get novelty and get a hit again and again and again. And this is nothing more than this root that the Buddha is talking about, except this is a more modern manifestation. And so this impulse to go, to get, to seek, to want is insatiable, and the text says it's like a bottomless pit. The more you fill it, the more it takes. You can never fill it because it's irrational to begin with. But this is at that root. So we're just looking at different manifestations, how this comes across over time. And in the 21st century, it happens to be this kind of thing. Now, what we're trying to do, perhaps, in cultivation is to disentangle or to quiet that impulse a bit, to catch it for what it is and catch it that it's an irrational longing and searching, and then you can see it for what it is and you quiet it. But also, it takes consciousness and it captures consciousness. So consciousness, then, awareness, gets captured by this impulse. The text's really very clear about this, and we begin a process then of more seeking and more wanting. And in fact, if you look at, say, again, I'm going back to, say, social media and what's going on now, is that actually is a mechanism and a project to capture consciousness. The goal is to capture consciousness, not necessarily sell you this product or that product or whatnot, but it's to actually capture your very nature of your consciousness itself. Because who owns that then owns everything else. Once your consciousness is captured and held in that space by whatever that is, you are no longer a free agent. You are subject to this habituation, this indoctrination, what's the word that's used? Pavlov uses it in his psychology of conditioning. So it's a conditioning factor. And so by letting our consciousness be captured in this way, we've given up our most precious resource. And in fact, most people I talk to now say marketing and so forth has changed. the primary goal is to capture consciousness. It's not to get your attention for a particular product. So once consciousness is captured. So the whole point of cultivation meditation is to recapture your consciousness, to take it back. This is really what's going on now. And it's particularly intense at this time and place in history because the mechanisms and the means for capturing it are very, very sophisticated. You can think, no, I'm going to beat this game. But believe me, there's very, very smart people being paid a lot of money to figure out how to capture your consciousness. And they're good. They're good. Some of the exposés coming out of Silicon Valley right now are exposing some of this, but it's also being squashed because it's revealing the genie in the bottle, so to speak, or I like to say the wizard behind the Wizard of Oz kind of phenomena who's turning these screws. And it's not a question of you're weak or your will. This is exquisite energy that's devoted to capture your consciousness. So I mentioned once before that prescient thinkers, both East and West, have been aware that this was the emerging phenomena of the 20th and 21st century. This would be the issue confronting humankind. Not so much the gap between religion and science or power and wisdom, but the actual nature and capture or liberation of consciousness itself. That was going to be the big phenomenon. This is something for those who are interested. My teacher, Master Hui, was talking about in the early and mid-60s. And interestingly, I was just doing some study too that Martin Heidegger, who was a German philosopher, roughly about the same time, in the post-war period started to pay attention to this as well. And one of the statements he was making was about this technology and what's not. Wasn't so much that the standard question is of what uses it would be an idea there's neutral technology and then it's just a question of how you use it or don't. He was actually going into the level, he says the very nature of the technology itself is already fundamentally restructuring human nature. And so it's not about the simple question about is it good or bad or how we use it or abuse it, but the very structures of the technology itself and making that technology itself fundamentally alters human consciousness into a different mode completely. And he said it's there where the danger point lies, not in the uses of it so much, but in the actual acquisition of it and then the corresponding alignment of our consciousness with the technology that then shifts it to another. So this is really interesting stuff that was going on. I'm talking in the 50s and 60s now, aware of this. So anyhow, I've digressed a bit, but I mean to say that this text and this passage here is a profound antidote, if we can penetrate it, to this problem, because it's actually analyzing at a deep level. And all he's saying here is as long as you have this confusion that you're not whole and complete, that you're inadequate, you feel you're inadequate, therefore this insecurity, therefore this anxiety, therefore this longing and urging, as long as you don't nail that, your consciousness is subject to capture.
Can I quickly mention another news item?
Excuse me?
Can I quickly mention another news item?
Oh, sure.
More digression. Did you also see the headline about how they can change people's basically political viewpoints by introducing fear? So someone can start out being liberal and then they say, okay, actually you want me to contract a virus here. And then they have them look at, say, immigration policy again, and all of a sudden they're opposed to it because the fear factor literally changes their consciousness.
Yeah, part of the capture of consciousness is to either manipulate, to stimulate, or gather emotions, because emotions can go hand in hand with this. So along with these two phenomena, the actual emotional stirring up and then the actual capture of consciousness. Because we don't think of consciousness, we think of it abstract, but it's emotional. And so when you have these two things going, and it's become very sophisticated. So in a sense, this is the last remaining national park for human consciousness. These temples and monasteries are reserves that you can go to get back in touch. You know, we have Yosemite or Glacier or whatnot, and you can go there and you can get a feel of nature again, as it's meant to be, and it has a transformative influence. But where do you go to recapture your nature, your consciousness? And in a sense, ironically, monasteries might be the last bastions of that ground where you would go to rediscover your consciousness before it's distorted, captured, and controlled. Now, the thing is, you can demonize the technologist or whatnot, and I don't mean to do that, because in a sense, we are creating them as they create us. Because of these unexamined wants and anxieties and whatnot we have, we're completely open to this. So it's a mutual relationship here. However, I think what the Buddhist teachings are is that you will not be able to change that except by changing this. So if you can change this and cut off and see through that underlying fertile ground that gives rise to this constant seeking and wanting and craving, the objects of habituation will never cease to come in. But once you cut off that root, everything is empty. And that's the meaning. I'm just jumping ahead to the passage tonight on page 92. He says, all things are still and empty. How could they be arranged? Still and empty means they have no fundamental nature of their own, and they therefore have no pull and attraction on you unless you are confused about that. Then their ultimate stillness and emptiness becomes charged with meaning. They become objects of your desire. And once you have a subject of desires, the objects of desire are infinite. There'll be no end to the the stimulants that could come in to get you. Now it's this thing, now it's a TV, now it's this object, now it's this person, now it's this thing. It just goes on and on and on and on. And this is the basis of samsara. So this is interesting stuff here. But I'm trying to make it more concrete for us, because we start to see this as metaphysical abstraction or something. It's not. It's talking about something very real and palpable in the human condition that we're dealing with all the time. To the extent of which, and I'm just saying, there is a corresponding discovery that the pathways, the neural pathways and the hormonal pathways that are associated with addiction for substances are also the same neural pathways and hormonals that are associated with what's called behavioral addiction. In other words, social media and so forth. What? Explain again. Just as heroin can become an addictive substance, that same neural pathways and similar hormones are actually activated and running when it's behavioral addiction, which is socially and legally permitted. No one's going to bust you for shooting up your iPhone on the corner. But you are, in a sense, shooting up. So you have to understand that this is very interesting and goes to this deeper ground. It doesn't matter what the objects are. The actual underlying neuropsychology of this is almost identical. This is very interesting. Okay. Now I forgot why I went on that one. Oh, I was saying by changing this. So unless you get into that and understand that unexamined longing and urging, that free-floating anxiety of need and wanting and craving, which you don't often feel until you get quiet, because we're so much caught up in it, we take it for normal. And only when you sit quietly for a while, you find yourself in an environment where there isn't all that stimulation, do you start to either feel, or and for most people it's increasingly, I need something, I want something, Even up in Maine, people get there after 2 hours, let's go into town. Why do you want to go into town? Well, it's like there's nothing going on here. That was the point. What do you mean? No, nobody told me it was going to be this quiet and still. Tranquility, the loons and and everything, and they hop in their cars and race down these roads in the forest, creating all this dust to go into town. To do what? The town is, it's about as big as this block. There's nothing there, but they find stuff to do there. They run into other people who are looking for things too. And then the tourist stores do a business. They go in and buy these stupid little plastic things. Little plastic loons that go, ooh. When they got the real one, just feel but they won't go for the real one. They go in the plastic one. It's crazy. But the point I was trying to make is that this becomes then an addiction. And it becomes an addiction you can actually see then when you try to recapture your consciousness. You will go through DTs. Now, DTs mean delirium tremens, which is what alcoholics go through when they withdraw from. They start to shake and sweat and go through hallucinations, and it's physically and psychologically hell. but there's also digital tremors. And then when you're saying the DTs are the digital tremors that you go through. And people have noticed this, especially among children and adolescents. The buy-in, the addiction buy-in is so strong and so heavy that in many cases they find it almost as difficult or as possible to get off of that as for people to break attachment to high-level drugs, cocaine, methamphetamines, heroin, and so forth. And reporting the same thing. They actually have camps and places where children can go now to try to break the addictive habit. And it's almost like a, what do they call it, 7 steps? I don't know how many, what are the steps? 12 steps. It's a variation of that kind of thing, or, you know, closest to nature and whatnot, but the symptoms that the children go through, and some of them stay clean for about 3 weeks or 4 weeks after, and then the urge comes again, and they what's the word they use? They relapse, remission, and go back. So I'm pointing this out to say, the root of this is where this text is going. The root of liberation is in these processes described here in these texts of how you gain control over your sense organs and your mind and your nature, and how you go into the deepest of places and let go and liberate and free it up there. So this is really, in a sense, more timely now than it was in the Tang Dynasty, and more necessary. So if I was going to do a time capsule with important things, I'd put a couple of these sutras in, rather than the Beatles, you know, record. But, okay, so let's go on. He says here, there's this line here, Jur Chung then asked the master, what is the meaning of not setting up? And the master replied, and this is his answer, when your essential nature is free from error, unobstructed, undisturbed, and unconfused, when prajna oversees and illuminates your every thought, you are far removed from the superficial appearances of things, independent and free absolutely everywhere and anywhere. What is there to set up? Awaken by yourself to your own essential nature. Awaken directly by cultivating directly. There are no gradual stages nor anything to set up. All things are still and empty. How could they be arranged in sequence? So he's playing off of, in the fourth line above, where Hui Neng is talking. He says, if you awaken to your essential nature, you do not set up ideas of so on and so forth. Only when you understand can you set up the myriad teachings. So the setting up here is now what he's asking for clarification on this last line. He asks, what is the meaning of not setting up? What does that mean? And what the Sixth Patriarch is saying here is, basically there isn't anything to set up, there isn't anything to establish, and even the teachings themselves are not absolute, but only arise in response to an entanglement of some sort. So you can set them up and create teachings, the myriad teachings, he says, if you understand that their goal is to get to untangling, and therefore the idea basically there's nothing to attain. So our grasping, seeking, and wanting is actually how we knot ourselves up. Where our feeling of anxiety and stress comes from is because this constant urging, longing, unexamined, starts to knot us up physiologically, emotionally, intellectually, until we actually burn out in a stress mode because we're so afflicted by this unsatisfied urging and longing. So he's saying the teachings then are set up, but you can only set them up if you don't promote that. If you actually use them to untangle that, to get to somebody say, hey, everything's okay, I can let go, there's nothing to attain, I already have it. Then you can set up teachings. But if your teachings cause the opposite reaction of craving and longing and fear and so forth, you realize then you are not setting them up expediently. So the setting up of the teachings can only come when you have your essential natures free from error, unobstructed, undisturbed, and unconfused. That means you have no longer the drive. That doesn't mean you lose a will to live or anything. It isn't about that. You're no longer driven by anxiety and stress and urging and longing. You are free. There's nothing, you see through it. So you're unobstructed, you're undisturbed. Undisturbed doesn't mean you're dead and dull. It means nothing throws you off your center. Most of our mistakes come not from what we do or don't do, but moving off our center when we do or don't do. this is really critical to understand. So it's not so much there's a doing or not doing. Oh, I'm a cultivator, I don't do anything. Or I'm not a cultivator, I'm a bodhisattva, I do everything. It's not about that at all. It's about how you do it. If you do it from center, from unobstructed, undisturbed, unconfused, then doing and not doing are the same. And it's appropriate. That's why he says, prajna oversees and illuminates your every thought. The wisdom that is nowhere attached, that sees that there's nothing to attain, this wisdom of prajna oversees all your thoughts. That's the driver. That's in the seat. As soon as that's not the driver anymore, it's confusion driving it, then no matter what you do, it'll be miss the mark. But if prajna, so you see, this is very interesting. Prajna is not like, I have prajna, I have wisdom. This is dynamic. Prajna oversees. What does oversee? Do you ever have anybody oversee? An overseer? Some of you never had those kind of jobs. That's an overseer. The foreman. The overseer is the guy in the field that's watching everybody work. If you watch these movies about indentured servants or slavery, who's the overseer? He's the guy with the straw hat on the shotgun, the sunglasses, and the whip. And everybody's got their eye over at the overseers who's watching over everybody. Work, do not, this is an overseer. A lifeguard is an overseer. Sees over the pool, okay? So the lifeguard doesn't say, I have prajna. No, I have prajna that oversees and watches and keeps people from drowning. So you can see prajna in this metaphor oversees and illuminates. It just doesn't oversee, but it sheds real light. Because sometimes without real light, what you oversee could be obscure, or you mistake it for something that isn't. So I mean, metaphorically. But you have to look at this. So it oversees and illuminates your every thought. You're far removed from just the superficial appearances of things. You're penetrating what they really are. And therefore, you're independent and free and absolutely everywhere and anywhere. Absolute anywhere and everywhere. This is what it says to the enlightened person, all places are the same. And you might say to the enlightened person, then all people are the same. All things are the same. And this is the meaning where he goes, awaken to yourself, by yourself, through yourself. This is the embodied. You got to do it on your own. You are the Buddha of your own nature, and you're also the demon of your own nature, and you have to cross and transform all of that within your own process. There are no gradual stages ultimately to set up. All things are still and empty. So this is the realization. The stillness and emptiness occurs when you see through and put it down. There's nothing to get, there's nothing to lose, everything is okay. It doesn't mean you cease functioning, but you function in an unimpeded, free and easy way. This is called wondrous existence. That's why the phrase is true emptiness, truly seeing through the superficial of appearances and seeing through your own urging and longing. When you see through, empty that. When it's seen as empty, that's wonderful existence. So this is really important because what it's suggesting here not is some vacant, nihilistic state, but actually a profoundly liberating, wonderful, wondrous state. That's why the Heart Sutra begins with when the Bodhisattva of Lakiteshvara was practicing or cultivating prajna wisdom, he or she illuminated and saw, Jiao Jian, illuminated and saw the five skandhas as empty. And then the next line is really interesting, and then crossed beyond all suffering and difficulty. Wow. No, it wasn't like saw that they were empty and then just said, what the hell, why not? I'll just, do Hamlet's to be or not to be, that is the way. No, it was, oh, now I'm free. Now everything is open and responsive and flowing because I've seen through and cut these things off and then my sense I'm not attached to them anymore. So therefore, free at last. So this passage, this whole context of this is extremely important. One, to understand that the attaining, not attaining thing is actually the last shackle that we break through to liberate. And once that liberation comes, you respond appropriately, it's free and easy, it's independent, and so forth. So it's describing, you could say an elevated state of human consciousness, or you could describe its natural state of human consciousness, but you're describing a fully functioning, perfected human being, not someone who's dead or over with or pulled back or not engaged. And that's why he says you're everywhere engaged but nowhere attached. This kind of ability then happens as a result of that. Okay, that's a lot. But let's see what happens at this. He bows. Zhicheng bowed and vowed to attend the master morning and night without fail. And then said, I don't know why they have this. He came from Taihe in Ji province.
Because they lived happily ever after.
Well, he attended a night without fail, but we also know that in the end here, the master sends them all away. So, why does he attend them without fail?
It was a good teaching when he gets it.
What's that?
He knows a good teaching when he gets it.
He knows a good teaching. He knows a good thing when he has it. That would be, if he said that, the Sixth Patriarch would whack him on the head. That just shows you don't have it. It's a good question why he stays and attends to the master. Now, attending is caring for. If you attend to the master, you make sure that the health and food and everything is there, because not because you're looking for something, but you realize that this is a precious source to keep alive in the world. And so your actual action of teaching and transforming others is to support the teacher while the teacher's still alive. That's one way to see it. Any other takes? Yeah.
So for me, the whole idea is that practice never ends. So even though he might have become enlightened, it doesn't mean he's done. It's an ongoing type of thing. So he needs to continue. The master is helping him to continue his practice.
Well, no, this is a very interesting point, because the master eventually says, I'm not the master. What? You should follow the master, but don't follow me. And he's saying, so it's you follow what the master's following, not the master. And so for this case, to attend to the master, you could read in this sense, not so much that he attended to Hui Neng, but he attended to the master, which is his own mind, his own nature, day and night. So you could read it as that way, that this was a total, what's called, later we'll go into this, the single practice samadhi, walking, standing, sitting, lying down, never separating from the master. Because in his teaching, the master is your own mind and own nature. And not understanding that, you miss the master. Understanding that even if the master is far away, you're still close to the master. And he says this. On the other hand, if you don't understand this, even right next to the master, you're still 100 miles away. Yes?
Actually, in the Chinese, there's no the master. It just said he bows and attends. But the word attending implies master, but there's no actual subject of master.
So technically speaking, we probably should have put into brackets, attend, bracket, morning, night, without fail.
Right.
But either way,
Next time.
next life.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's important that you get the spirit of this in the sense that even if he's attending to the master, what that means is that he's not kind of racking up brownie points. He's actually, I would say, from my experience, he's agreeing to go into the fire and really get the heat turned up. Because to attend to a master is not a fun thing. Masters rub your fur the wrong way. They give you constant tests to see, do you really understand? So, and that little bit that you're still hanging on to, that's where they go. And you might, it's a tugging, I'm going to keep it, I'm not going to show it. And then, oh, really? You're going to keep it? It's like, oh, okay. Then, something, and pretty soon, all of a sudden, you're just tricked and it blows up, and the master says, aha, what's that? I thought that anger was gone. I thought that jealousy was gone, and so forth. So attending to, even if it's the master, is a very difficult thing to do. And so it could be also the other thing that is very instructive, and I stress this again, we are reading the words of the text and we're getting something from that, but we have to use our imaginations a bit. And I don't mean like fanciful imagination, I mean sort of interpolation imagination to embody. What's going on here? What is this master like? What is someone who has seen through the five skandhas and has reached the truth of not self look like, talk like, walk like, eat like? How do they respond to things happening, changes in the weather, disasters, and so on and so forth? Because the embodiment, that's what he uses this language here in the passage before. Understanding you are embodying the Buddha. So the master, in a sense, is an embodiment of the teaching. He's not just a purveyor or kind of a Google search mechanism for the teaching, but actually a living, walking, breathing embodiment, because that's really what the Dharma is meant to be. It's meant to be embodied. And so when you find someone who is of this caliber of embodiment, then the teaching and the lesson is often not in what's being said, but what's being manifested in the simple things of a daily life. And in fact, the Vajra Sutra starts with Subhuti seeing this for the first time. The Buddha comes, he sits down, he washes his feet, he has his meal, and just does these ordinary things. And Subhuti all of a sudden goes, oh my God. Oh my God. And everybody's what? He says, it was right here before my eyes. And every mannerism, everything he does, he's manifesting perfect enlightenment. And so the discussion then begins with Subhuti. How did you do that? How did you get there? What's your state like? And the whole Vajra Sutra is this back and forth between Subhuti and the Buddha. But it starts, the moment of its starting is this realization that in the ordinary is the extraordinary. And in the mundane is the transcendental. And it's right there, and it's not like there's a division between the two. And Subhuti saw that. So this embodiment thing is extremely important because that's where the real learning takes place. I'll give you an example. If you're a parent, some of you are parents, not? How many people are parents? Okay. How many people have been parents? Okay, we're thinking about it. Anyhow, just to tell you, when you get in that zone, embodiment is everything. Okay, you can give your advice to the kids and talk to the kids, and they're watching you. They're watching you like a hawk watches the field. And if there's the slightest inconsistency between what you say and what you do, they'll nail you. They will nail you. And they are just exquisitely finely tuned to spot. So as you think you're a parent and a teacher, they are looking exactly at what you are doing. Even how you breathe, even a sigh tells them something that's either right on or off. You cannot fool your children. You can, I would say, until maybe, well, I don't know. I would say one or two, but even there, it happens really quick. They figure out this whole thing. So in the same way here, embodiment is, in fact, the totality of the message. And if it's not walked, no matter how well it's taught, it's still not the way. So again, this might be what's going on with him. Okay, we did finish that section tonight. I was going to go through the last exercise of the five skandhas, but maybe since we're a little short of time, I'll save it for next class because we did the two. But I wanted to just finish up because I said I'd say a little bit about this Heraclitus guy last week. So I know some people were counting on that. It said he had distinguished parents, but that they say of everybody. With many of these early philosophers, we don't know much about their lives because they just didn't record much. And so scraps are lost, and then things get lost over time. But his thing that he prided himself on, and I think in a good sense, is that he was self-taught. And by self-taught, he mean the language he used, he said, he heard no one, meaning he went to no teachers per se, but question himself. So his self-taught was to observe things very closely, observe himself, observe nature. And he said, he questioned himself, and then he said, he was only interested in the things that can be seen and heard and learned. This is what I most prize. Seen and heard and learned through this self-questioning. So in a sense, he was a kind of autodidact, but not necessarily using books, but using his own insights, his own person to look at things really carefully and question. And that's where I quoted you last week. He said, basically, everything that is in the realm of wisdom is available to us on our faculties that we have with us right now, if we would only use them correctly. So this is where he was going. Yes, and as a Sixth Patriarch, you might need a teacher, but you only need a teacher because you don't remember how to use your faculties. You become lost and confused or morally dissolute, and you cloud up your fundamental nature, so you can't. So you use a teacher. But he's saying the same thing. And then he said, people fail to notice, they don't observe what they do when they are awake. Wait a minute. Really? Oh, I know what I did. You know, I know what I do when I'm awake. But do you really know what you do when you're awake? Why you do it? There's another text we can look to later. This is called the Mango Stone Sutta, in which the Buddha tells his son, who was about 6 or 7 at the time, you really don't know what you're doing when you do it. You don't know what you're doing before you do it. You don't know what you're doing while you do it. And even afterwards, you're not clear what you did. And this was regarding, he was telling lies. So then he gives him, he says, what's a mirror for? And the son says, it's for reflection, Dad, Buddha. And he said, in the same way, before you do something, you should ask, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? What is the effect going to be of such and such and such and such? And if it's wholesome and healthy, it's going to benefit others and so forth and not afflict and cause anxiety and stress and so forth, go ahead and do it. But if it's the opposite, don't. This is what he meant by being awake. And then he said, but if you miss that point and you're now doing it, right while you're doing it, reflect with the mirror. What's going on right now as I'm doing this? How does this feel? Because sometimes we miss the first. But let's just do words. I have this thing to say something to you. Okay, and I shouldn't. But you start saying it. Actually, while you're saying it, you can hear the blowback immediately while you're saying it. You can hear the glass break, the nails scratching across the chalkboard. And the Buddha is saying at that time, when you're in the act of doing it, this is very interesting, because sometimes we don't know until we're in the act, but in the act of doing it, there's a mechanism of feedback that we can have, our sensibilities tell us. And he said, if that's the case, then stop, and so forth. But he said, no, if you got to the third point, you didn't see it beforehand, you didn't catch it while you're doing it. Now afterwards you're going, duh, gee, I don't think I should have done that. I shouldn't have pulled that trigger. You know, then he does the same reflection and you go back, and then there's a corrective thing. So some later time I'll share that whole text with you. It's really interesting. But what Heraclitus is saying, the same thing. We're not really aware of what we're doing. We can make a list of what we did today, but to get to that level of what we did, why we did, and what the effects were. So they fail to notice what they do when they're awake, just as they forget what they do while asleep. So again, you can see the parallel between the Buddha saying we're in a dream even while we're awake, and so forth. Most people live as if they had their own private understanding. And this is talking about that solipsistic, narcissistic frame where we're egocentric. I quoted you last week his thing about 2 lines. One line was, you can't step twice into the same stream. But another translation is, ever newer waters flow on those who step into the same rivers. Ever newer waters flow on those who step into the same rivers. And then we went to the next one, and he said, and ever newer peoples step into the same rivers that ever flow, and so on and so forth. So the river's changing, the person's saying. Now, what this is leading to is something that was with tonight's passage. I asked, part of the contemplation we're using, what doesn't change in your experience? Just begin that contemplation as the first step and examine. I don't know if some of you have tried that, working with that a little bit. Heraclitus had the same idea. And his idea was that every event, every phenomena is in a period of waxing and waning almost simultaneously. So it's waxing and it's waning, but it's never just staying. So this idea of change was to get at the idea that we want to set up and claim that something's fixed and certain and unchanging, but our experience is contrary. And he maps it out and he says, so in every moment, everything's either waxing or waning, it's coming or going, but it's never staying. And that's what he meant by the flux of things, and where you would get to have wisdom is to contemplate this. Because the urging, the longing I was talking about, this thing wants to make it stop and stay, pretends it stops and stays, and does the grasping, but it can't make it stop and stay, and that's where the rub occurs. Where we get caught up is this constant struggle to make something stop and stay and hold, when in fact there isn't anything that obeys that, including our five skandhas, our own mind and body. So this is difficult to do, but it's basically beginning contemplation. I just want to point out that Heraclitus was onto the same thing. And one of the techniques they would use is very similar to what Buddhists use in breathing. You just start with something very simple. You just say, okay, my breath. Is it ever stop and stay? Okay, so just like next Friday as you sit in meditation, there'll be a time the inhale starts, there's a beginning, it fills, and then it stops. And you got it. I got my breath. And then as soon as it kind of reaches, you can't actually tell, but it's also starting to wane. Now, we enjoy this. We live by this. If we stopped it, we'd die. But then, instead of taking this as a fundamental truth, we go on to say, but that's different about every X, Y, and Z. But everything is just like this breath. It's just waxing and waning. And you can never get it. It's never stopping. Because as soon as it stops, then you get sick and you die. So if you just use the breath in this contemplative way, just saying everything is waxing and waning, and there's no point in stopping. It's just going in and out and back and forth. My breath is like this, my thoughts are like this, my feelings are like this, my emotions are like this, my relationships are like this, my body is like this. From the micro of every cell, you can see it's coming, waxing, and waning simultaneously. Nothing in the body is still. We think, I'm still. But if you could hook it up to sound and everything, and it would just be a cacophony. It would be like two symphonies out of tune. Just, I mean, they've done that. You've seen those exercises where they drop the microphones and so forth deep inside the body, and you're going, oh my God, it's like really noisy. It's like these storms we've been having. And there's nothing that's not moving. And so from the micro cell, then you go to, and my day came, it waxed, and it's waning, and it's almost over, and I'll go to sleep, and that's a waxing and waning process too. I go to sleep, and then I come back up. And as the day goes, and then you have a week, and then you have a year, and the seasons. You know, you just look at the seasons. So you're going from the micro up to the seasons to your whole life. Now, that's a little trickier, but you can actually see your whole life just as a breath. You know, first one, here I am, first breath in, okay? Adolescence, you're still sucking in a little bit. You know, about 40 or 50, you've reached and then there's the waning. And at what point, it doesn't stop. So, and you go, and the planet itself goes through a daily turning and flowing and waxing and waning. And then we think, yeah, but we got the galaxy. But the galaxy itself is going through a period of waxing and waning. So the whole universe. And the sun that we rely on is waxing and waning. So when you contemplate this, you actually just extend it macro and micro, macro and micro. This was an exercise Pascal, the French philosopher, would do. He'd say, we are caught between infinite infinities from the micro to the macro. What is this? We are caught between these two infinities. So you think about these in these terms. But Heraclitus was doing the same thing, the Buddha's doing the same thing. So all they're just saying is get real and try to find in this reality something that isn't that way. And when you finally let go of this, then you're beginning to do the illumination of the wisdom. Okay? So much on Heraclitus. Nobody knows how he died. Apparently, a good part of his life, the latter years of his life, he just lived in the mountains eating seeds and things off of trees and drinking stream water. he actually found it hard to be around people.
And you said he was the father of Epictetus?
He was what?
He was the father?
Yeah, he's considered the father of the Stoics. The Stoics credit him. He was called the obscure and the weeping philosopher. And the reason apparently he was weeping was because he was so upset at the unconsciousness of fellow beings. And so he became like not exactly a misanthrope, but he pulled himself away because his sensitivity was so heightened. He says most people are just going and hurting each other and doing all this stuff, and they're not even aware. It was so hard for him because he was so sensitive to taste. Well, you think, if he's self-taught and he's observing, his sensibilities are really finely tuned. And then he goes into the average, I mean, gosh, drop him in Washington, D.C. today, he would just see that he'd totally collapse. I mean, given the unconsciousness of what's going on, right? So, anyhow, that's why he was called the weeping philosopher. And again, they don't really know how he died. He died alone outside in nature someplace, somehow. Yeah. By the way, it's really funny because just one last anecdote. We've been reading Hamlet this week in another class. And I forgot how good that graveyard scene is. Some of you know Hamlet? Anybody know? Yeah. Well, Hamlet, this young woman, Ophelia, dies. She drowns herself, and so they're going to bury her, but she's not allowed a legitimate funeral because she committed suicide, so the church said she can't be buried on sacred ground. Huh?
It's debatable whether or not she committed suicide.
It's debatable.
Yes.
Because?
She was mad, sort of.
I mean, somebody drowned her?
Because she's mad, you can't really say she committed suicide.
Oh. Well, now this brings up a really interesting point. Because you're mad, you're not responsible for your actions. Oh. Okay, well, let's not go down. We'll do that for next week. Anyways, she couldn't. So the grave is being dug out in the woods someplace. Hamlet wanders through and he sees this guy digging a grave and he's going, "What's going?" And he starts to contemplate because Hamlet thinks a lot. And this version I saw is really good. Those of you who want to watch the video version of this, because it's the full-length version with nothing taken out. And in terms of characters, the gravedigger who's doing this is Billy Crystal. Wonderfully played. You think Billy Crystal's this comedian? No, he does this really well. So he's taking the skulls and the bones out to create a new space. He's digging the grave, but the grave is already filled with skulls and bones, so he's taking them out and putting the skulls there, and Hamlet's going, whoa, whoa. This has made me ponder. And then he holds up a skull, and he's looking at it, and the gravedigger says, "You know what that was?" And he says, "No, that was the court gesture of the King Hamlet, which was his father." But he doesn't know that this is the Prince Hamlet. And he looks at it, and he flashes back when he was a kid, that he wrote on the back of this court gesture, that he hugged him, and he told their stories and whatnot, and all his makeup and his loving of life and color, and there's all left is this court gesture. And it's really done well because the court gesture has buck teeth, and the skull has buck teeth. So you can see the back and forth as he's holding up the skull, and he's reflecting on the impermanence of things. And then there's this wonderful passage. He says, Alexander the Great, too, now is like this. He went out and he conquered all these lands and became famous, and he was on coins and so forth. And then he has this wonderful line that really struck me. He said, and he's just gone back to dirt and dust. And I can imagine, he says, at some place, some poor person who has a hole in their mud hut goes to Alexander's grave without knowing it, takes his ashes and forms them into a ball of mud and plugs the hole of his wall against the cold night for the air coming in. And this is the ultimate use of Alexander the Great. Well, and it's just, Shakespeare's so good at this, it just sort of dismantles all your baubles and fame that you're going after and just says, okay. And then I was remembering when I wandered a graveyard once in my youth, coming across one of the gravestones, and it said, as you are, I once was. As I am, you will be. And whoa. That was all that was written on the tombstone, but it was really, moi? Anyhow, we finish up that section. We'll go next week into the next one coming up, and we'll do the third contemplative part next week as well. So, any other questions, comments? We can debate whether you're responsible if you're mad. Because see,
She didn't intend to drown. She fell from a tree. You have to read it in context.
well, and the point of the play is that Hamlin himself does some pretty crazy things. He kills his uncle, and he kills her father. Basically, it's a bloody tragedy, okay? And the question is he responsible for that because he's mad, or is he feigning madness? So, what's the famous line of that? Wise enough to play the fool, sort of thing. So, anyhow, that's a whole different thing. It's good. If you want to spend a nice evening diverting, sort of, you can take a look at this video. For some people, it's too heavy, right? Okay, I'm assuming since no one announcing tomorrow night there'll be a lecture on the Avatamsaka, or perhaps Jin Fo is lecturing on limitless light.
Yeah.
Okay, and then anything else you know that's coming up?
Same as usual.
Huh?
Same schedule as usual.
Same schedule as usual. So that doesn't change. Sorry. Okay, that being said, we'll do the transference in English.